When we invited Srimati Arundhathi Subramaniam to be with us here this afternoon, she very readily and graciously agreed. Initially, she said that she will just say a few words in acceptance, but I'm extremely grateful to her for also agreeing to talk about something I think which will be very, very important for young dancers of this generation to hear, and something that will really set the tone for the further discussions in this Navadhisha conference, how to actually read a poem. I'd like to invite Srimati Arundhathi Subramaniam.
Thank you. I'm actually still processing what Ravi just said, because it's not very often that one actually hears poetry being talked about in a particular way. And I was very struck by the sensitivity, the insight, the attentiveness. Thank you so much, Ravi. Really, thank you. This means a great deal. I want to start by thanking, of course, the Trinity Arts Festival, Murli, Mr. Muthukumar, Apoorva, who's convened the conference, and all of you for being here, but very specially for this award, which is something I feel very deeply honored by. And I'll confess that it is both unexpected and deeply affirming all at once. Unexpected because poetry being the form that it is, one is quite accustomed to working in the shadows and remaining there. And I do believe very often poets are just meant to be there, and their works are supposed to make their way quietly out into the world. And if one is lucky, one finds a reader somewhere with whom the work resonates. But poetry today, more than ever, seems to be a shadowy, marginal, inconsequential form. That is how it is perceived by many, and I was acutely aware of that when I started out as a poet. And I have poems as well talking about poetry as this dowdy, non-particularly glamorous, and yet compelling, deeply compelling form that I decided to center my life around. There are many reasons why poetry seems like such a strange animal. I've often called it the art of the murmured voice. And in the era of the megaphone, there's nothing that seems as out of place as the murmur, as inaudible as the murmur. In an era of information technology, the poem becomes an even more befuddling presence because it doesn't give us information in the way that we are accustomed to receiving it. That makes people even more uncomfortable, I find. And there is, of course, the fact that we are all beneficiaries of generations of unimaginative school teachers who have done their best, I believe, very often to kill a very natural, spontaneous love of poetry that many of us have had. So there are many factors militating against it, and yet some of us obstinately continue to write and to read poems. And I'm just so grateful that you're here today to help celebrate poetry above all else. I'm very, very grateful, very delighted to be here. And I must specifically mention, apart from Valli, who's a very dear friend and collaborator, we also have with us Professor Narayana Rao, whose work has been very important, interestingly enough, not just to me when I put together my anthology, Eating God, but also to Valli, because Valli and I have actually worked on a collaboration of your Annamacharya translations. So there is something very significant about this convergence, really, on so many levels. Thank you. Since Apoorva suggested that I say something about looking at a poem, As she mentioned, I was actually a bit hesitant at the start because I didn't want to offer some kind of how-to manual. It seemed out of place, and in any case, that's not the kind of set of prescriptions I would be comfortable with. I actually feel many teachers have offered me that, and I'm still recovering. But what I would like to do is to share with you some pointers that I still remind myself of. I still need those pointers because surrounded as I am by poems, by a maelstrom of poems, as a writer and as a reader of poetry, there are times when a certain jadedness enters, and I wonder why on earth I'm doing what I'm doing. And those are the times when I need a palate cleanser, and I remind myself of these pointers. So I'd like to share these, just 4 pointers with you, and in the process remind myself of why I do what I do. The first pointer that I'd like to offer is actually a reminder for all those who have found poems to be intimidating, esoteric, difficult, riddling. Just a reminder of what it was that turned us to poetry in the first place. For me, it was the realization that poetry is actually a kind of dance. It is, in fact, language that is mercurial, kinetic, unpredictable, startling. I remember my earliest encounters with poetry were precisely this, the realization that prose was a much more terrestrial animal, but poetry was language that was capable of diving and leaping and swooping and soaring the way some of you dancers actually do on stage. And I realized that understanding all that went on in a poem was actually secondary to my love of it. That love, that exuberant love of poetry started early when much of language was actually unintelligible to me. And I remind myself of that today, that poetry is a kind of dance, a verbal dance to which we are all capable of responding even before we start understanding what's going on. And related to that is a discovery that I also made at the age of 12, but these are discoveries we make again and again. The discovery that poetry is also a kind of music, a kind of verbal music, that one is capable of recognizing it even before one has understood it. One is capable of responding to it even before one has decoded it. And of course, there are teachers who want us to decode poems and paraphrase poems, and that can sometimes add a layer to our understanding of it. Certainly spending time with poetry deepens our understanding of it, but our capacity to respond to it as music is something that we are all democratically capable of. And this is something I need to remind myself of, because I think very often our encounters with poetry, and this is what I hear again and again, we have 2 responses. One is, I can't understand what's going on, so maybe I'm not smart enough. Or, I can't understand what's going on, so maybe the poet is being deliberately obtuse. Either way, the result is the same. We turn away from poems. And I think this is unfortunate, and it's important to reclaim for ourselves that inborn capacity to respond to poetry. That brings me to the second pointer that I'd like to share. And that is the fact that poetry is not doctrinal, it is essentially experiential. It is inviting you to an experience. It is not inviting you to content. Much too often, we pull out content from a poem like currants from a bun, as if this is the only thing of consequence. We see a poem as a vehicle for ideas. We see a poem as a versified argument, often forgetting that in the finest poems, the sensuous and the abstract are integrally wedded. If you were to try to pull them apart, the poem will collapse. In a poem that works, a concept is crunchy. You can crunch into it. An idea has color. In a poem that works, thought has texture. Thought has grain. This is not sociology. As I often say, poetry is not sociology. It is not a sermon. It is not a soundbite. Poetry is sensuousness. And if we lose that, we lose the poem. I was just talking to someone yesterday about the introduction to my book of Bhakti poetry. And in that I say something that I'd actually like to bring back here again. The idea that a poem is not offering you a conviction. Poetry works with a much older sorcery. It's not for nothing that poetry is considered the oldest form of literary enchantment on this planet. A poem works on you not as conviction, but as a kind of contagion. It doesn't work on one as idea or ideology. It works as infection. It seeps into you when you least expect it. It colonizes you, your bloodstream, your marrow, and in ways that you never expect. And before you know it, you are transformed by a poem. But its workings are subterranean. So I'd invite you to do this. When you find yourself drawn to a poem, look for the many resources that the poet uses. Frequently you'll find the poet using image, sound, tone, and a host of related resources, in fact, to achieve this particular form of contagion. It's interesting then to start seeing what's at work. I was recently at an Akram Khan performance in Australia. This was Akram Khan performing the Epic of Gilgamesh. It was a riveting production, and I was watching it with a prose writer. And in the middle of this performance, I found him shifting uncomfortably in his seat. And by the end of it, he looked dismayed. And I said, what exactly went on for you? And he said, I actually found because I didn't know what was going on. And I wanted to know moment by moment what was happening. I realized that for me, that was not a problem. It's not that I could have decoded every moment. I felt invited. And that for me is really the bottom line as far as all art is concerned, and certainly poetry. I don't want all my mysteries decoded. I don't want to live in 100-watt illumination all the time, but I do want to feel invited. And the finest poems do that. For me, this particular dance production did that. It invited me to a place that was dark, subterranean, and I watched, awed at these dancers with their superbly articulate bodies, this incredible mix of rigor and beauty and single-mindedness and intensity, to just watch them perform. That was enough for me. It's interesting here to also mention the many ways in which poets communicate. I was talking to someone just yesterday about Neruda and his political poetry. I'm not making a case at all for poetry that is without politics here. I was thinking of Neruda's poem on the Spanish Civil War, and I was looking at why it works for me. I don't know how many of you know this poem. I'm not going to read it. It's far too long. But if you were to read this poem, you would find that it works because it uses image. Even while the poet is saying, I'm not going to speak of lilacs. I'm not going to speak of poppies. I'm not going to speak of geraniums exploding in my Madrid garden. I'm going to speak only of what's happening now. And then he leads to those resonant and heartbreaking lines. Come and see the blood in the streets. Come and see the blood in the streets. Come and see the blood in the streets. This poem would not work. Those 3 lines, which are simple statements, would not work without the images that preceded it, which suddenly bring home to you that the color of flowers is the color on the streets. But ironically, for horrendous reasons, that's the color flowing down the streets. And this brings me to my 3rd point, and there are just 4, so just 2 more to go. I want to say this. I think we often forget that poetry is an invitation, again, not to a single truth. We often read a poem and feel we have to pick out a single point, when in fact the strength of a poem is the fact that it is a complex, many-layered truth. And how can one say this and not mention Professor Narayana Rao and David Shulman's translation of Annamacharya? There is a poem much loved by me and Valli, and I read it all the time when I present from Eating God. This is from their book, God on the Hill, where you have Alamelumanga, the goddess, speaking of her Lord Venkatesha, and in the course of a single poem, short poem, you have her say, he is the master, and he's my slave, all in the same breath. And as readers and listeners of this poem, we effortlessly understand what he means. Why? Because who has not known what intimacy entails? Who has not known the subtle, shape-shifting quality of a romantic relationship, where master and supplicant, superior, inferior, all these roles are constantly in states of flux? Who hasn't known that? And who hasn't had a glimpse or just smelt the danger and the unexpectedness of the spiritual journey that seems to be leading us to a point of a possible non-dual condition where we don't know the difference between master and disciple. We don't know the difference between bhakta and God. We don't know where the divine ends and the human begins. We don't know where Venkatesha ends and Alamelumanga begins, where all these definitions, all these categories are blurred, terrifyingly, excitingly blurred, uncertain, seismic, full of latency, full of possibility. I was recently talking about Tukaram to a bunch of students in the US, in fact, at Yale. And I was reading them this particular poem translated by Dilip Chitre, where he says, for me, God is dead. And immediately I found students beginning to seize on this and say, oh, that's what he meant. So this is his position. God is dead. It sounds like this is his philosophical position. It sounds almost Nietzschean. He's saying all the right things. In fact, he's actually saying exactly what I believe. And I had to stop and say, this is really not about belief. And what he's offering us is not a philosophical position. What he's offering us is a poem. This same poet is capable of yearning for his God. This same poet is capable of arguing with his God. This same poet is capable of loving his God, of bargaining with his God because he's a grocer. This very same poet is aware that bhakti is this radical, disruptive technology that can dismantle himself. He's willing to dissolve into it. He's also aware that it is a technology so dangerous that it can dissolve God himself. Tukaram is capable of saying all of this and meaning it. And we are able to understand, because poetry is this swift, direct communion with ourselves. I've often described poetry as the shortest, the most pleasurable route to oneself that I know. And that brings me to my final point, the final pointer that I often have to remind myself of, which is the fact that a poem is not just about its meaning, as I've said again and again. A poem is also about its pauses. A poem is not just about meaning, it is also offering you a reprieve from meaning. It's offering you the license to pause. And those pauses, I think, far too often, particularly with many performing artists, and I'm talking about so many that I've known, and so many that I've seen, there is often a hurry to fill in those pauses. There's often a hurry to dramatize those pauses when it is in theater. There's often a hurry to illustrate, because we sometimes forget that a poem is meant to be about those leaps, that a poem was never intended to join all the dots. But when you start spending time with the pauses, you realize all that a poet is choosing not to say. So, Janabai could have told us that the erotic and the existential are deeply connected. Janabai could have told us that the body and the beyond are part of a seamless continuum. Janabai could have told us that the sensual and the sacred are inextricable. She doesn't say all that. She just says, I eat God. That's all she says. I eat God. I drink God. I sleep on God. I buy God. I count God. I deal with God. God is here. God is there. Void is not devoid of God. God is within. God is without. And what's more, there's God to spare. Think of all that she has not said. And I'd say finally, that's really what poetry is. It's an invitation not to explain the pause. It is an invitation to experience it. It is not an invitation to decode the pause. It is an invitation to inhabit it. And with that, I'd like to thank you very much for being here, for your attentiveness, and I'd like to thank Murli and Mr. Muthukumar and Ravi, Valli, Professor Rao, whom I'm really looking forward to listening to, and all of you dancers and laypersons alike, all of you who've decided to spend your morning here. Thank you.